Dr. Mlondlozi Zondi is a provost, postdoctoral associate, and assistant professor of comparative literature at the University of Southern California. Currently, Dr. Zondi is working on a book project that studies critical Black artistic practices, which tend toward the dead. Zondi's work has been published or is forthcoming in the Drama Review, ASAP Journal, Text and Performance Quarterly, Mortality and Propter Nos. Mlondi's presentation today engages Paul Stopforth's aesthetic meditations on Steve Biko's death, figuring the photographic negative for purposes of counter-documentary. Stopforth sought to challenge the apartheid government's ideology about anti-apartheid political activists as treasonous, discrediting and undermining the official narrative. The Biko series opens up a plethora of questions about the necro and negro-philia of seeing and the limits of rendering Blackness through a fixation on anatomy and biology. Questioning the political promise of figural artistic strategies that mobilize the corpse, Zondi asks, why is it necessary for the world to see the image of the corpse, yet again, in aesthetic practice, in order to reflect on violence? And what modes of recognition and identification are produced? What is enacted by recruiting, inviting the viewer to adopt such seeing? We'll pass it on to you and we'll have a discussion after your fruitful presentation.
Okay, thank you. May I please get a sense of the time or duration? Because I'm not going to present the whole paper. I'm going to present some bits and pieces, just read. So it would be great to get a sense of time.
I think maybe we can give you 30 minutes to reflect and think with the paper, think through and with the paper, and then we'll have a discussion for about 5 minutes or so from the audience. And also I've got some questions that might possibly elicit more engagement. Okay.
Okay, great, that works. So 2 things. I'm not going to do slides, but I will show some of the images now. Let me see. I'll share some of the images now, can take a look at them, and hopefully it'll make sense why I have chosen not to have them sort of projected in a sustained way. Share. So what I will be presenting today is from a longer paper entitled Cultures of Photodromic Enjoyment. And I'm not going to present the whole thing, but the paper is forthcoming in Mortality Journal. So I can keep you posted about that and when. So these are some of the images that I think with from Paul Stopforth's repertoire. The first one being this one, which a lot of people in the visual arts might be more familiar with. And then this series, The Interrogators from 1979, and the early work. So if Steve Biko was murdered in 1977, and this was a show that I'll briefly talk about in 1978. Okay, stop. Apologies if like the transitions are not as smooth because I'm jumping from section to section and there's a lot that I'm going to leave out, but I'm happy to discuss it during the Q&A. I would first of all like to thank Ziana, who was instrumental to making this possible. Due to the technical issues, she left the comfort of her own bed in Cape Town. It's really cold, so I really appreciate that. So the title of the paper is Cultures for Photogenic Enjoyment. And what I'll skip are the conditions and the kind of context for Steve Biko's death and how he was murdered. And I'm just going to assume that the audience knows a little bit about a little bit of the context. The essay engages aesthetic speculation about violence, spectatorship, and pleasure in Paul Stopforth's Elegy and the Biko Series. These are artworks that are oriented toward a counter-evidentiary logic aimed at disproving the evidence provided by the apartheid police. By invoking the corpse, these images sought to unveil silences and full omissions about violence in the official apartheid document. This investment in evidence, alternative or otherwise, however, I'm arguing capitulates to the terms of the dominant regime by participating in the struggle for evidence in the first place. So I mark the futility of counter-evidence exhibited before or in reference to a regime that disavows Black violability by design, even when presented with abundant evidence beyond reasonable doubt. For that reason, I ask, what would it mean to eschew participation in these evidence tournaments that always already repudiate the counter-evidence of anti-Black violence we would submit, no matter how obvious or compelling? Is the problem before us about evidence, or does aesthetic counter-evidence also counterintuitively legitimize the house of law it aims to overturn? Philosopher David Marriott's writings direct my approach of tracing the waltz between scopophilia and necrophobia in the image of the Black Dead, not merely as features of Paul Stopforth's individual unconscious, but as civil society's consistent dreamwork. Questioning the political promise of figural artistic strategies that mobilize the corpse, I ask, why is it necessary for the world to see the image of the corpse again in aesthetic practice in order to reflect on violence? And what modes of recognition and identification are produced? What ideological fantasies drive the ceaseless reproduction? Are the libidinal structures harnessed by the portrayals limited to empathy and a desire for justice, as artists often state? What drives the readiness to perform and feel, or make others feel, again, the psychosomatic pain endured by those who were brutalized by the state? In these aesthetic renderings, the viewer is invited to either empathize with the corpse or maintain a critical distance that supposedly allows them understanding of the structures and interactive multi-scalar systems that sanction Black Death. My curiosity lies in what is enacted by recruiting or inviting the viewer to adopt such seeing, and what Stopforth's artworks enact within and beyond his authorial intentions. The popular saying, seeing is believing, is one of the major operations I wrestle with, specifically the desire to see the evidence of anti-Black violence to believe its occurrence, or for the image to move people to political action. It is not my goal to salvage alternative evidence conceptually or methodologically, as I am questioning evidentiary attachment itself. Evidence fetishism is insufficient because it is the belief in the occurrence of events only when the visual evidence of their occurrence is archived. It does not take into account the non or anti-evidence of things not seen. The violence of apartheid was self-evident and meted out publicly, but that self-evidence failed to hold evidentiary integrity when presented by Black insurgents to prove their so-called innocence. So in the main, I'm arguing that anti-Black violence is that which cannot be believed. Counter-evidentiary images of the corpse can serve as a belated atonement of this refusal or incapacity to believe, and they do the work, now framed as counter-evidence, of persuading the state to believe the violated Black. Evidence is simultaneously all too ubiquitous and arrives too late. Further, in engaging Stopforth's work, I do not demand the work of art to do the direct work of toppling structures of racial sexual domination. Artworks generally do not have a direct impact on the kind of structural change needed for addressing colonialism and apartheid's material dispossession. Artworks call out, scandalize, or embarrass those in power, commemorate and deify, as well as document in indirect ways those ideas which are prohibited when addressed in regular speech or the language of public protest. In the process, artworks also bruise us and reinscribe us into the scene of our dishonor. In 1978, a year following Biko's assassination and before the creation of the artworks that I will discuss, Stopforth presented an installation of sculptures titled Deaths in Detention at the Market Theatre. And those are sort of the final images that I showed. I'm happy to talk about them later on, but now I'm just going to say that the sculptures represented the brutalized, and the brutalizer was not figured in sculptural form as part of the installation. It was only later in 1979 that Stopforth put a face to the perpetrator in a mixed media triptych of paintings entitled The Interrogators, which was like the second to last image that I showed, where he portrayed dictators Alfredo Stroessner, John Foster, and Pinochet. And in these works, Stopforth is responding to torture and despotism more generally, considering other regimes in Paraguay and Chile. Art historian and forensic specialist Catherine Smith describes Stopforth's eulogy for Steve Biko as, quote, hovering between drawing, photography, sculpture, painting, and also demonstrating kinship with all these media and yet claiming a singular materiality, end quote. Figuring the photographic negative as counter-documentary of the murder, Stopforth sought to challenge the government's ideology about anti-apartheid political activists as treasonous, discrediting and undermining the official narrative. As an elegy, the painting overtly laments and monumentalizes an individual secular martyr, while universalizing that martyr as irreducible to Steve Biko. The pictured figure, while painted with a shade of black, bears no obvious resemblance to Biko, a move that Catherine Smith calls, quote, a tactical dehumanization, end quote, utilized to deter political censorship. Compositionally, the contrast between the dark pictured figure lying on a red surface in elegy is worth extended commentary. And just as a reminder, so the image I'm talking about is the first one I showed, with a figure lying on like a surface, a red surface. While the red surface in elegy evokes the red that is recurrent in anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggle posters of the 1970s, as well as evoking the red wine that represents the blood of Christ in Catholic transubstantiation, South African photographer Santu Mofokeng's writing in a special issue of Chimurenga, dedicated to the life, legacy, and philosophy of Steve Biko, offers a harrowing reorientation to deciphering this color contrast and what it might unknowingly enact. Mufokeng recalls his early experience in photography, working at a newspaper darkroom where he assisted with developing negatives. While working in this space, he overheard a famous South African photojournalist conversing with an accounts clerk about a photograph of the Silverton siege in Pretoria, where a black cadre lay on asphalt bleeding to death. The famous photojournalist applauded the image as a, quote, masterpiece, and continued to praise it, declaring, quote, there is nothing as beautiful as black skin and blood. It makes beautiful contrast. There's nothing like it, end quote. And this was said as a truism, as a general fact that those working in that period understood and attempted to reproduce in their photojournalism. Stopforth used so Paul Stopforth used the same color contrast in elegy within a cultural context. There was a shared consensus to relish the putative sublimity of black skin and blood, the contrast between black and red. Philosopher Mabucho More posits that to understand racism, we have to pay serious attention to sexual phenomena. It is in the turbulent realm of imaginative sexuality that racist thinking achieves its most spectacular topsy-turviness and messiness. And that was a quote. I would add that the reverse also applies, that racist thinking, malicious or well-meaning, reveals its own psychosexual dimensions, the fantasies and drives that organize interaction or intercourse with the Black corpse. Art historian Zamenzele Ntsele has argued that this type of sadomasochistic pleasure in South African art buttresses apartheid's psychosexual stability. For Ntsele, quote, racism can be reproduced through pleasure, or better yet, racism is pleasure, end quote. Apartheid's sexual psychosis involved the formation of more than 200 anti-miscegenation laws and amendments. Anti-apartheid resistance pushed against the sexual panic. The drive to return to a miscegenation prohibited by the state is one of the prominent features of anti-apartheid struggle, itself a multiracial pursuit. The act of supporting the Black struggle was an outlawed form of miscegenation. White anti-apartheid struggle was partly a drive towards the reauthorization of intimacy with those whom it was illegal to touch or be in touch with. This then imbued miscegenation with a moral characteristic that was then politicized. Paul Stopforth's meditation on the corpse and his gesture of seeking justice for the Black dead moved by way of and against this sexual panic. It transgressed anti-miscegenation logic by virtue of its attachment to the Black and Black suffering, thereby forming an interracial alliance that did not lie outside of the complexities and ambivalences of libidinal attachment. This is the sexual content of anti-apartheid that I am pursuing here. And then I sort of go on in the paper to sort of lay out a theoretical framework for what I'm understanding to be like the connection between a kind of scopophilia, like the pleasure, the kind of sexual or sexuated pleasure in viewing spectacles of the Black dead. And for that, the theoretical framework mostly sort of is in conversation with the work that Fred Moten has written on the image of Emmett Till, and Saidiya Hartman's rejoinder in her essay, but where she's actually responding to Moten and inquiring about the dangers of looking again, since Moten's point is that we have to look at the image to hear its music, which is always already sort of filled with this kind of sexual content, a kind of enjoyment, sexual enjoyment we are confronted with that we actually cannot escape. And Hartman, in her rejoinder, is asking about if this terrible beauty that Merton talks about resides in, is something akin to remedy. I'm happy to talk about that later, but now I will read a little bit from my meditation with the image. Specifically, its religious or Christological undertones or overtones. Yeah, so for some, Steve Biko's death is understood as not in vain, but a symbol of strength, because he was seen to have paid the ultimate sacrifice for a higher purpose. And that's a quote from Shannon Hill. There's an elevation of Biko as a martyr who sacrificed his life for the masses. Stopforth's Christian-oriented approach to portraiture joins a cohort of artists who turned to religious symbolism to mourn the Black political insurgent as martyr or Black messiah during anti-apartheid and anti-colonial struggles. Now I'm asking here, do comparisons and intertextual or allegorical references to the body of Christ when invoking Biko and the Black corpse obfuscate the particularity of Black enfleshment? In her reading of Hans Holbein's The Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb, Julia Kristeva identifies Holbein's painterly intervention as challenging Italian iconography's conventions of embellishing and exalting the dead Christ, particularly by ennobling the face through a detached solemnity, while mobilizing other feminine figures in the frame whose faces surrogate Christ's grief and suffering. And then I go on to talk about how Kristeva, talks about this portrayal, Holbein's portrayal of the dead Christ, and sort of what it means for corporeality and understanding of corporeality or corporeal integrity. So for Kristeva, the non-representable, which is the conclusion that she arrives at, is conceived as a dissipation of means of representation on the threshold of the dead person's extinction and death. The Black's non-representability, in my sense, is not about a dissipation of means. And the Black's extinction is not inaugurated in the moment of physical perishing. Can Black death ever be represented or conceptualized? And if so, can that representation or conceptualization ever be self-referential by avoiding Christological references, either by circumventing the augmentation of the void with properties of the subject or questioning representation altogether? In their incapacity to evade this obfuscating equivalency, these art historical references inadvertently reveal the Black corpse as without known analog. In other words, they acknowledge Black unrepresentability through their own failure to represent, hence the turn to analogy. So Kristeva writes that okay, so these procedures at their most radical state conflate and analogize Biko's corpse with the abject corpse theorized by Julia Kristeva. Salamo Tarafa cautions against presuming the explanatory power of the abject corpse for the Black dead. That is, the main aspect of Kristeva's abject corpse in Powers of Horror is that it is conditioned by jouissance, and abjectness allows the subject entry into the social order. Kristeva writes, quote, "It follows that jouissance alone causes the abject to exist as such," unquote. And in another book, Black Sun, Kristeva theorizes the corpse painted by Holbein as possessing, quote, "not a single impulse betraying jouissance," unquote. That is, the abject corpse of Christ falls adjacent to the social order and is defined by its possession of and participation in jouissance. The inverse applies to Blackness, as Black enfleshment is simultaneously constitutive of and barred a priori from the social order and the profits of jouissance. So Salamo Tarafa's discussion of Black enfleshment directs us to question whether the aesthetic rendering of Biko's corpse through Christ-referent analogy produces in Biko a subject who also does not betray jouissance. Can this also reveal something about the ambivalences inherent in Black consciousness's strategic uses of Christianity for anti-apartheid ends? And then I go on to do a reading of the image itself to just kind of ascertain or show how Paul Stopforth's reliance on the kind of body which is like the abject body that Kristeva describes, how that kind of representation or non-representation actually fails a priori, because what we're dealing with here is an attempt to represent a kind of corporeal form that is actually devoid of habeas corpus. And then maybe to conclude, just for now, I will say that, so if Moten says that we, quote, have to keep looking at these images so we can listen to them, my question is, what else is audible in Paul Stopforth's lament for Steve Biko besides what I understand as just electrified requiem, the image's allegiance to leftist, good-intentioned, or religious moralist traditions and intertextual references does not necessarily deliver a traversal of unavoidable necrophilic and negrophilic fantasy, civil society's repetition and fixation of the photodermic image, much like the state's repetition of it to quell rebellions, functions to soothe anxieties and offer relief, pronouncing, as Derek Hook posits, quote, "white bodies are not destined for this fate," unquote. Anti-Black violence incubates in places least expected. Art, too, can be that improbable lethal sword, an instrument accomplice of graphism, slashing sanguinary marks on Black flesh. Art's sublimity, pleasure, and beauty are entangled with and rest upon cruel, sadomasochist violence. Apartheid visual culture as a photodermic reservoir deserves serious attention that would reveal the regime's psychosexual dynamics whose surface academic scholarship has barely scratched. Thank you, I'll end there for now.
Thank you so much, Mlondi, for that generative presentation. We already have questions. We've got people clapping. I thought it was hands up. Maybe I'll begin with the first question, which thinks around, I guess, this libidinal attachment to, I guess, Black death in some sense, and how it operates within the collective unconscious. So I'll begin by asking, your essay in Thinking With and Reflecting on Stopforth's works on Biko touches on the failures of his deployed counter-evidentiary logic. Instead, you posit that this mode of practice reifies the prescient circumstances within which fixations with the violated Black body operate. The ways in particular in which this way of working or methodology is intimately implicated to the libidinal attachment with anti-Black violence that we see circulating in multiple life worlds. Could you possibly maybe expound and elaborate on the sentiment and how you begin to build it up within the paper itself? Or your research?
Sorry, do you mind repeating just the last part? Sorry.
The ways in which this way of working or methodology is intimately imbricated to the libidinal attachment with anti-Black violence that we see circulating in multiple life worlds. So I would like for you to possibly expound on it in relation to also your greater project. I understand that you're currently working on a manuscript that's looking at artistic practices that can figure around this question of, the violated body. And I think maybe an elaboration, or I guess going back to that sentiment would kind of animate the engagement first, or our discussion.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. Let me give it a try. So my project, as it currently stands, which is my larger project, is sort of is interested in this. Okay, so maybe first of all, I'll start off by saying that I received my training in performance studies, and one of the sort of big debates in performance studies, which is as an institutionalized field that is sort of adjacent to and even maybe conjoined with, but not quite, theater studies, is this question of remains. And in performance studies, the question of remains and the debates around remains is not necessarily situated in, or exclusively situated in, remains as we might traditionally understand them, maybe if we work in sort of archaeological anthropology or archaeology, as sort of the like the stuff of the body that pulsates and perishes and goes through putrefaction and all these processes. In performance studies, the debate on remains centers around the metaphysics of presence, and more specifically, it is the debate about how to actually write about performance when you don't have a textual thing, or like a kind of visual textual thing. What does it mean to write about performance as something that some would say passes away as it happens, such that someone like Peggy Phelan would argue that performance sort of disappears or passes away, and that the writer, the task of the writer is to then reproduce that, but that reproduction is not the thing itself. It is kind of, a simulacra of the thing that has passed away. So that's how I came into the question of remains in this kind of sort of performance studies debate. And it was interesting to me because I was also not interested in thinking about questions of presence or disappearance in these purely empirical ways, although that is important that people die. But I was convinced that the way that Black people die is not and cannot be reducible to a kind of physical perishing, which is how, everyone just kind of conceptualizes death. That death is like, oh, there's life, there's kind of plentitude where you live your life or maybe suffer or whatever, and then what comes after is the death, and then followed by the afterlife or whatever. In the archive or the library of thought that I was engaging in sort of Black critical thought, I got a sense that there was a kind of ontological death that was being sort of talked about and that people were thinking through. So to answer the question, I'm really interested in thinking about the ways that we die, and the ways that we die that are unanalogizable with sort of these kind of traditional sort of ways of dying, that have a kind of clear sort of narrative progression, where for us, death is not exactly something that like someone like Derrida in his book Aporias, would describe as a step, like a kind of transitional step, but that the ways that we die and remain, that it is anterior, that it is actually indistinguishable from what we call life. But not only just indistinguishable, but it is also kind of anterior. It anticipates our so-called becoming. It is lived in our immediate moment and is ever encroaching from the future. And so therefore, that cannot be sort of analogizable methodologically. It means that we actually need to reconsider some of the routine sort of protocols of reading and protocols of reading death as a kind of sort of anthropological instance that has a certain sort of progressive, sort of temporal structure. So I'm interested in, but I am interested also in sort of the stuff, the kind of the quote unquote the material stuff, the bones and the flesh, from in visual representation, and I'm interested in questions of how that death is the bedrock of modernity in general, but also the bedrock of our sort of modern or modernist protocols of reading and interpretation, that how we see. Yeah, I'm very curious about like how about what exactly sort of Black death allows to the world, and what it endows in this particular case is a kind of white self-reflection and reflection on sort of all these big sort of political philosophical concepts like democracy and consent and empathy, that actually happens, that like Black death is actually the threshold and the condition of possibility for that, and that without it there wouldn't be any of this. I don't know what the world would look like, but yeah.
So maybe I'll go into the second question. What I'm maybe trying to understand is that you're saying in these instances of Black death, or the way in which, I guess, the proliferation of Black death within, I guess, within this I guess libidinal attachment to also with this fixation, right, with the violated Black body in itself, it recuperates a certain understanding of humanness. Maybe I'll go into this question, well, as configured within, I guess, the Western epistemological tradition, right, in that, you know, it allows for the other to exist, right, or to imagine themselves, like that being a whiteness, I guess, in its most explicit state. But I'll say in some sense, or ask, your analysis implicitly contends with the affective particularity of Black feelings, right? Feeling Black as a processual, as a buttress against the processual forms of violences that beleaguer Black life in different forms. So your text, in my opinion, becomes a rejoinder and a refusal to perform yet again when we are called to bear witness to the wanton violence certain bodies are subject to. So can you possibly touch on how historical and contemporary conceptions of the human have hinged on a particular and recurrent formulation, one that posits a whatever life on Blackness, I guess, in relation also to thinking these works that Stopforth creates?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if...
So I was building it also from the sentiment you think was Zakiya Jackson's work. And I was, whilst reading your essay, also trying to think or reflect on it in relation to her book on being human, I guess, or her considerations of being human, or who is considered human, or within the conceptualization. I don't know if I'm possibly like fully elaborating.
Okay.
Or
yeah, so I mean, I think I'll start off by saying that, like, you know, all the brutalities of modernity that I don't have to repeat here, definitely condemned or damned us to where we find ourselves. And the response over the past few centuries has been about the response, sort of in Black thought, has predominantly been about, one, critiquing the undersides and the perversions of a humanist project. And in most of those projects, that I read and I'm vibing with, I think where the point of departure for me, or where I kind of pause, is when there's a kind of prescription that if sort of the violence of humanism has instantiated all these things that I will not repeat, then what we need to do is a kind of refurbished humanism, a humanism that somehow that either brackets or disavows or ignores this kind of hegemonic humanism that led us here. And I'm not as convinced that in the world that has been created, that response to refurbish humanism or to revamp it and give it like a black face or an indigenous face, or like is actually super useful in getting us to the types of questions that would overturn whatever needs to be overturned, instead of being like, instead of just building a black version of that. In the essay, in this particular essay, I think a lot with the work that David Marriott does in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytics. And what's really devastating about the work that David Marriott does on the Black psyche is that it shows, the work shows, he shows that whatever we think of as a kind of Black space separate over there, or Black feelings that are separate over here, over there, or Black anything, is always already sort of haunted. If we think of sort of W.B. Du Bois, what he said about like sort of these two warring ideals existing at the same time in the Black psyche. So in terms of like how we understand our own, even our own pleasures and aesthetic judgment, what is repulsive and what is always already carrying sort of these remnants of a humanist project, even when we claim to be doing a Black thing, because the Black thing is always already haunted by the thing that we should otherwise obliterate, which is why David Marriott asked the question, why do you do, and I'm terribly paraphrasing here, what do you do with an unconscious that hates you, right? So that's why in the essay, I insist, I emphasize that what I'm critiquing here is not, I'm not psychologizing Paul Stopforth as an individual who has like perverse ways of sensing, seeing, knowing. I'm more interested in the regimes of sensing, seeing, knowing that we as Black people are completely not outside of, even when we think we're doing something like a Black project. And so maybe what needs to happen is to maybe push more and radicalize more what we think of as a Black project, and specifically a Black project against humanism, as opposed to like a Black project that is a refurbishing humanism or giving it a Black face.
Yeah. I will open the floor up for discussion and possibly elicit questions from other people. Or possibly I could ask another question if people aren't. Okay, maybe I go back to another question that I wanted to ask you. So you make a compelling and interesting suggestion when you note, open quote, photodermic representations of Black corpses are victims of who are victims of apartheid are an inroad to understanding the psychosexual intricacies of colonial and apartheid anti-Black domination. They reveal the repertoires of desire that fester not only in scenes of spectacular brutality, but also in liberal artworks that stake claims to empathy and solidarity with Black broken flesh. Close quote.
I was also curious in terms of furthering the discussion beyond the representation, and really trying to figure out what Mlondi was kind of problematizing from Fred Merton's insistence that we listen. to Black death, I suppose, versus looking at it. And at this point in time, I'm also thinking about Tina Kamp's listening to images.
The frequencies of images might impel, right?
Right.
And way of engagement also that doesn't necessarily prioritize this ocular-centric fixation with always having to gaze or see the Black body, right? How in other ways we can evidence or think around questions of violation, or, you know, thinking around continued violence without necessarily performing the same violence. I think it's quite interesting that he touches on that. And that was one of the questions I also wanted to ask him. I think that was what this question was pertaining to before we lost, actually. Yeah.
I also see Mlondlozi is also kind of saying that they're also interested in more frameworks from the continent on these notions of Black death and practices of refusal, with voicing a desire. And I suppose that's also the question sometimes, because when it comes to the kind of pan-exilic transnational conversations, they also, like, specificity can also be something that gets easily lost. And I suppose even in terms of this idea of martyrdom, and what Mlondi also started to kind of speak to about the ritualization of Black death within Christian contexts, and those also have their own orders of visibility or invisibility. I think it is also like a very crucial question to kind of speak about theorizing or thinking about refusal from the continent. I don't know if Nomdimiso, you want to kind of add to the discussion.
I'm opening up the floor for questions. We had a short discussion about your text as you were gone, but I will open up the discussion. Amu had an interesting point that she had made, and maybe she can elaborate on it whilst you were away. She had made the point. If she can touch on it, elaborate.
Sure. I guess I was wondering if you could kind of speak more to the point that you made about kind of problematizing Fred Moten's insistence that we not necessarily, well, I'm not exactly sure the context of what Moten was saying, but kind of insisting that we do look at these images to not necessarily hyper-visibilize and subject them, but to listen to them rather. And so I was just wondering if there is kind of, I suppose, merit in that. And I'm thinking also in relation to the provocation that Tina M. Kamp does in her book, Listening to Images. And so I was just wondering if maybe you can kind of speak further to that point.
Okay, let me give it a try. So, Moten, I mean, I think with Moten with Moten's book in general, which is pretty unavoidable, you know, in Black performance theory. But for this paper, I'm sitting closely with a section of his book in the break that is about the murder of Emmett Till. Right. So in that, I mean, the book in general is arguing many things, but I mean, one of the interventions is a methodological one for Fred Moten, and methodological in the sense that he's trying to help us move away from this kind of traditional sort of modes of interpreting the image by suggesting that, like, what happens if we actually listen while we look, right? So what is the music of the image? And so to tie this back to the image, the open casket image of Emmett Till, that there were debates about how absolutely sort of immoral and unacceptable that was. And Merton methodologically is asking for us to slow down in our engagement with the image, and not, because the thing is, with a kind of oculocentric focus, there are certain things that we can miss. And for him, it's not so much that the image of the Black Dead is giving us something that is absolutely terrible. For him, he thinks with this phrase by the jazz musician Charles Mingus, of terrible beauty, right? That there's what we see in the image, or what the image has in store, or what the image contains of the Black Death, is not reducible to suffering, but that it is actually, there's something aesthetic about it, right? It is not making a moral judgment about whether that aesthetic thing is good or bad. He's just saying that there's actually something aesthetic about that. And what would it mean to look at these images of the Black Dead as doing aesthetic work, and then what is that aesthetic work, and then what is the sexual content of that aesthetic work that it is doing. And so that is why he claims that we have to listen while we look. And he, at some point, he has a quote, I think from Amir Baraka, saying that the image of the dead contains life, is life itself. I'm paraphrasing badly. So that was interesting to me, that the image of someone who has been murdered in this brutal way, that it allows methodologically for a reading for Merton that is attentive to sort of the aesthetic aspects of that moment, but also where he finds life in the image of the dead, that duality of life and death in the image, that it's not just a brutal death. He finds life, and he finds something that has a kind of aesthetic vitality. I don't know if he would use the word vitality because that's so loaded, philosophically. And then later on, I mean, he co-wrote an essay with Stefano Hani on Michael Brown, after Michael Brown was murdered by the police, where Merton at some point reads again this kind of aesthetic reading of the Black Dead, where he reads the image of Mike Brown as one, an improvisation, and as Mike Brown's refusal to fall or refusal to stand, right? So he's making an argument about like how, Western philosophy privileges this kind of verticality, and it even sort of trickles down to how we understand corporeality or proper corporeality, and that Mike Brown being killed is somehow there's a resistance to that. There's a resistance in that Mike Brown falling and dying is a resistance of the vertical. That's Fred Merton's argument. So I was really just intrigued by what was presented here, by Fred Moten, who doesn't, by the way, sort of disregard or disavow questions of the kind of sadomasochism that is happening in this aesthetic moment, right? He does sort of acknowledge the pornographic or pornotropic elements of this type of aesthetic seeing. He does acknowledge the erotics of Black Death, but what he tries to hear is this kind of music, what the image is musicking. And I think my questions come from there, sort of in partnership with this one essay by Saidiya Hartman, Why Am I Venus in Two Acts? Oh my God, I'm forgetting that. Where she asked to me what was a very harrowing question about, okay, if Fred Moten is saying that we need to look at the image so that we can hear it, Hartman is asking, okay, so when we look at the image to hear it, is that like then something that is akin to remedy? Like, why is that what we're being asked to do? So if the attention to the image is just purely ocular, it's just about seeing, what we get is kind of this maybe even perverse erotics, right? And he's saying that we need to listen to the image. And my question, I guess, to Moten is, what else is there in the image besides the same kind of terrible beauty and the erotics of Black Death that were there when we were engaging with the image in an ocular sort of sense? Anyway, so while I'm not antagonistic, towards like this kind of methodological proposition, I do wonder about what if we adopt the methodology, what becomes revealed to us outside of what we already know, which is just kind of this dual terribleness and yeah. But I do think it's an important essay because it really does sort of theorize how the thing that we call Black art or Black aesthetics, even when we try to theorize it in these kind of very vitalist ways, that it is a thing that actually relies on so much on our suffering and our death. And so it actually forces us to question our investments, for example, in the transformative potential or capacity of the aesthetic, if the aesthetic or the Black aesthetic cannot exist without this kind of, or in tandem with this kind of suffering.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very clear. Thanks.
So my question then would be, sorry, I'm going to have to leave soon. I just have to attend to another.
Mlondlozi had a question on the chat. Maybe we
Okay.
can go to that one.
Okay, let me read that. She had specified, I'm quoting, I'm really interested in more frameworks from, on more frameworks from the continent on notions of Black Death and practices of refusal, not a question, but voicing a desire. I guess it's more a statement.
The continent, which one?
Of Africa.
Yeah, because I don't want to assume. Repeat the question, please.
I don't think it's a question. It's more so a statement. Says, I'm really interested in more frameworks from the continent on notions of Black Death and practices of refusal, And then obviously she substantiates by saying not a question, but voicing a desire.
Okay, well, I will attempt an answer, which is definitely not going to be perfect. So first of all, I will say that things come in, emanating from the continent does not obviously necessarily mean that they sort of provide us with the kind of theoretical and political sort of tools that we need to understand what we're going through. That is not to say that we privilege something from another continent or whatever, but it is also for me to say that I would ask, I guess a question to that comment about what that is doing sort of methodologically, like I understand what it's saying. I'm sympathetic to it, in the sense that if we understand, sort of like knowledge making, especially knowledge making emanating from the imperial core, but I guess my question to the comment would be is, I wonder what the comment or question presumes about a kind of area studies framework and what it, as opposed to perhaps a kind of Black framework that understands sort of paradigmatic questions about Blackness on a kind of global or even planetary scale. But I understand an aspect of the comment that is presumably about sort of implicitly critiquing sort of the kind of knowledge economy, especially privileging knowledge from the imperial core. What I will say is that, like I said earlier, I'm interested in the way that I'm understanding or trying to understand death is through sort of these ontological questions. I'm not sitting so much on the ontic. So, I think that there are fabulous anthropologists and ethnographers or ethnographic oriented thinkers in the world and in our continent who do this work about funerals and dying, which is also very important. But I think that's not where this project is situated. It's not situated in a particular geography, but it's situated in a particular sort of a knowledge cluster or global Black conversation that is mindful and respectful of sort of scholarship that's happening on the continent, but also knowing where my work sort of diverges from some of the investments that I do not share.
We have another question from
And there was
the
something
audience.
about refusal. Yeah, I don't know what to say about refusal. Maybe I can just say something very general about refusal, and that is, I think refusal, Black refusal in our current order can only exist in this kind of institutionalized way where it is sort of incorporated into the systems of order that I think our refusal, if it exists, for me, is more sort of helpful when it is in service of eviscerating these systems of order instead of being the kind of Jack Russell of the academy, right? There's a way in which I'm very skeptical about even the term refusal because of how it has just become like this kind of Jack Russell for academics to sound radical when actually they, academics, Black or white or whatever, actually that is something that they police the most, especially when coming from Black academics. So I'm very skeptical about refusal.
Substantially touched on. There's another question in the comment section or the chat. Vasumzi asks, could you please clarify the non-relation between Black death and representation? Is Black death unrepresentable, and in what ways? Or Black death makes or preconditions of structure, representation and modernity, the structure of representation and modernity in the first place, or both? I hope that makes sense. Well, yeah.
I mean, I will just say quickly in the interest of time that that's exactly the question I'm asking about representation, but also representation, because, you know, in this work, in these artworks, one has to think about representation in both of these terms. And okay, so I mean, I think the clearest one is the kind of representation, which is like sort of presenting again these images, but also just representation as a thing that, yeah, I mean, I would have to, I mean, it's one of the things that I'm thinking with in my work. I don't know if I have a clear answer right now to the second part of the question about Black death preconditioning the structural representation of modernity. I mean, I do know that in terms of, if we think of representation as a kind of depiction, there's some work, you know, going on about like how there's a kind of, I mean, there's work going on about like this kind of anterior representation of Blackness, which is like in these places, I think the work of you know, scholars like Parisa Vaziri and even Zakiya Jackson about the kind of prefiguration of Blackness being depicted in these societies where there were no Black people, and they did not know of Black people and had never seen Black people, yet there was this kind of robust sort of theorizing and representation of Blackness as the thing that precedes even our flesh. And that's why, I mean, for me, that's why these questions are so devastating, because like anti-Blackness actually precedes and anticipates Black people. Black people, you know, it finds an object in Black people to do the work that it does and hopes to do. And I would not maybe limit it to modernity as we understand it, again, by referencing the work of scholars like Parisa Vaziri, who sort of thinks about and with like the kind of Persian Arabic archive, but also Cecilia Cooper, and these are scholars that are actually like, and Matthew Chapman, these scholars who are thinking about sort of pre-modern anti-Blackness and the kind of prefiguration of Blackness as all these things, as being everything and nothing, to repeat Zakiya Jackson's words, prior to encounter. Yeah. So I get, I get what you're saying. I mean, we can talk about like the specifics that are related to modernity, based on what or how you understand modernity or where it begins. I tend to not think chronologically, because I think that this whole thing is just like the same and has been this way for a very, very long time. Again, which is not to say that it has to remain the same, but it has remained the same precisely because our tools of sort of tackling or attacking this thing are so liberal, even when they claim radicality. And what we want most of the time is not sort of the complete annihilation of the order. What we want is to be the black faces of it sometimes, or to refurbish things, or to refurbish all these modernist categories of sensing, feeling, knowing, as opposed to sort of thinking about what their dissolution would mean. And it seems to me that a lot of scholarship in Black studies is about a seat at the table.
I'd like to ask a question.
I can take one more.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, I can hear you. Let me just,
Yeah. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for sharing, and I really just wanted to say I'm really fascinated by this linchpin you've contrived. If anything, it actually, like, what I actually would like to ask more is like your feelings on the retrospect. Do you feel any violence imposed onto you by these images that are so fixated, if you are really trying to consider the body to the degrees that are to clarify these convictions about these what I believe to be shifts. So in that respect, I'd like to ask, like, in that retrospect, like, how do you feel about these grand shifts? These, for example, what can a millennial shift do to this spectra, which is actually progressed hitherto by the progress of time? What can a millennial shift do to this speculation? Does it not inform the cultures that are contrived about the contemporary and stuff like that? So how I'm actually like really like that interested in your speculation of the retrospect.
Sorry, can you please say a little bit more about maybe what you mean by millennial shift in this context?
So I was just saying a millennial shift as an example of a very grand shift. So this shift is actually the retrospect of, this shift is actually taken from the retrospect of this whole linchpin you've contrived, which is really oriented about Black death and the body. So do you feel any violence imposed onto you by these histories which were ascended to a different contemporary? Because that's what I feel is actually happening. Because right now, as you say, like, to what degrees can we obliterate what there is at this moment, with contrast to what time has, or rather the spectrum that time itself has contrived?
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure I understand, but do feel free to email me with the question, and maybe if I read it, or read it aloud, I will maybe have something. But what I will say for now is that I think what I'm describing is the case, is true, regardless of my feelings or how I feel about it. And I think one thing I also want to clarify is that, I mean, my argument in general is that Black suffering is not only locatable in images or sounds or whatever of suffering, right? What I'm saying is that the archive that we have to look at when we understand Black suffering is irreducible to like dying or like being brutalized in any sense. As someone who's, you know, trained in performance theory, the way that I sort of define some of that suffering actually comes in the way of applause and, you know, what Saidiya Harman calls innocent amusements. So this thing that people call Black joy, for example, is for me, is within that archive of Black suffering. So what I'm critical of as a kind of anti-Blackness is any look or any engagement with Blackness or Black corporeality, either as a kind of brutal enfleshment or like these expectations for Blackness to arrive at the scene as a kind of minstrel to assuage sort of phobogenic anxieties and make everyone happy. And so happiness and brutality are two sides of the same evil, brutal coin. I'm not really, what the images do to me personally, I think is important, but not essential.
I think that's quite sensible. That's quite sensible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mlondlozi. Thank you for this productive session that we've had today. And I'm really, really interested in the development of your book, and possibly engaging you again within this platform or another one, to discuss these issues further. I'm really, really grateful for you offering your time and also offering, you know, your beautiful words and thinking around these questions. And hopefully I see you again, or hopefully I see you in you know, like physically, as opposed to always meeting online or chatting on email. I'm also grateful to CKR for allowing us this space to think around these particular issues, and I'm interested in how the conversation will develop further. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you for such wonderful comments and questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks to our audience as well for joining us and for the engagement. Yeah. Until next time, I guess.